Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. In this presentation, I'm going to reflect on findings from the first stage of a research project comprised currently of 1-hour interviews with those in perimenopause or recently into menopause. So far, I've carried out 9 in-depth interviews, 4 of these identified as Methodists. So while clearly by no means statistically significant, and also at the initial stages of research and analysis, their generous conversations offer interesting qualitative findings and suggest where further research would be really helpful. The 4 are, helpfully, diverse in being a mix of lay and ordained, and in other characteristics that I'll keep confidential just because there's so few of them, but that already reflects the Methodist value of diversity. What they have in common, other than identifying as Methodist, is that they all offered or agreed to take part in the research to talk about the intersection of menopause and theology. So they had some interest or willingness to consider that intersection. And I say that because some I have talked to find it very hard to fathom how there could possibly be a connection, or they say that this doesn't apply to them. If you are one of these people, I hope you won't be by the end of this presentation. So a couple of very quick definitions. To be in menopause is to have stopped menstruating for 1 year. Perimenopause designates the experience prior to moving into menopause, which can be barely perceptible, or it can last 10 years and be very physically, mentally, and spiritually disruptive. And in my other work, I've looked a little bit at cultural and other factors that can impact how it affects you. Beyond the basics, there is a huge variety in the physical, mental, and spiritual manifestations of this transition. And I should also note here that menopause can also occur as a result of various medical issues and surgeries, and by some non-binary, intersex, and transgender people, as well as cisgender women. So in many Methodist congregations, the perimenopausal or menopausal body is, statistically speaking, the default body, the normal body, or as Daniel said this morning, it's usually ladies. I should say that, having said statistically speaking, this is an anecdotal claim at the moment. I don't have statistics. In addition, many of the women at all levels of leadership in the church, in the Methodist Church, and in ministerial training will be about to going through, or recently gone through, perimenopause and menopause. Sally Rush is a Methodist researcher at the University of Roehampton, looking at calling and vocation among lay employees of the Methodist Church. And in personal conversation with me, she told me she had received 104 questionnaires from these types of church workers. And of them, well over 2/3 were aged between 40 and 66, and 3/4 were women. So here we have one quote from one of my participants who talks about this issue of age in the church. One of the things I struggle with sometimes is that particularly within the Methodist Church, I am seen as a younger woman, which I find hilarious, because I'm quite clearly and obviously not. I'm heading towards 60. How is that young? And yet, actually, it is seen as being young because a great many of the people in the congregation are over 70 and 80. So that is kind of weird. Despite this, we often hear about the need to make adaptations or accommodations for this experience, as if it's a sort of niche, peculiar, marginal occurrence. It would make much more sense to see it as in the centre, with those who don't menstruate at the margins. So it's a sort of hidden experience at the moment, and my data suggests it's rarely openly spoken of, and it can, even saying the word menopause can provoke a chuckle or a smile. And even in feminist theology, there is vanishingly little research. So one of my participants said that transition from being a younger woman to being an older woman has been a lot more profound than I envisaged it might be, and obviously physical. The physical element of it came as a bit of a shock. I suddenly started thinking, gosh, what's happening to me, you know? And of course it's a completely normal process that all women go through, but it's not really talked about. And another said, I think it's good we are openly talking about it. It's just like dementia. You shouldn't have any stigma because half of the population will go through it at a certain point in their life. So there were a few things. So this issue is changing. It is slowly being talked about more, here, for example. And there are a few things that influenced this and influenced the experience of the participants that I interviewed. And one was representation. So in the Methodist Church, we have women in leadership. And as noted, they're often of a certain age. And one of my participants said, if you have female leadership, they're going to be more aware of issues around menopause and the practicalities of that, which was another key element, in a way that if you have all male leadership, they're not. Male leadership might kind of sort of get it, but in a way of, it might be more like, why are these women at church being annoying in the same sort of ways as my wife is? So the influence of having women in leadership was something that came up. And a couple of them mentioned menopause cafes, which is a little bit like death cafes, in that you could talk openly about death or menopause, or both, I suppose. So let me turn then to a slightly more theological angle on the data. 3 of the 4 mentioned the encouragement in the Methodist Church to shift language about God. And they were contemplating and assessing to themselves how, and to me, how their conception of God and God's representation in gendered language might be relevant to thinking about whether and how God might understand the experience of moving into menopause. So here one says, I know that I'm experiencing something that is a very physically, is a female thing to experience. Therefore, interesting, I need God to be a God that gets that. The Christa image I love. Nicholas Lee writes a lot about this Christa image. I think that's amazing, she says. If God is male and Jesus, well, we know Jesus was a man, obviously, then how can God understand or experience what I'm experiencing? So that's where I find it really helpful to tap into those characters from the Bible, Mary particularly. I do find that very, very helpful, which seems crazy, really. In the Methodist tradition, we wouldn't focus heavily on Mary. Participant 4 mentions Lavinia Burns' work in a slightly more nuanced take on this, thinking about the verbs that we use for God. Not making everything about God being really decisive and active, more about patience and about waiting and that knowing which is evolving. So there's thinking here that's really interesting about seeking affinity with God in the experience by wondering to what extent God is like us or we are like God. And there's a lot of room here, I think, for further exploration. So then, relatedly, there was also a strong sense of God's love and accompaniment. And again, the centrality of the love of God, I think, is a Methodist characteristic. This participant says, I really value the relationship with God, which is to say, I believe I'm who God made me. I believe I'm following my vocation and I trust God. That doesn't make everything easy. It doesn't make everything smooth. Doesn't make everything less painful. But I probably feel more broken by some of the things that I've heard about other people in ministry than I do for myself. So then we see a sense of a strongly embodied theology. It's obviously an embodied experience, and how the body starts to connect with their theology. One says, I think I have a greater sense of being someone who's embodied in all the wonder and fragility of that now than I did in the past. So a new kind of relationship with one's body and connecting that with one's theology. We find a sense that the created, changing body, there's a determination to see that as good and to see themselves as created, that they're made in the image of God and that their body, in perimenopause especially, which is very disruptive, is not broken. And I think this is partly culturally influenced due to the current medicalisation of menopause, almost treating it as a disease, which it isn't. So there's a sense of the created body as vulnerable, shifting, and yet very valuable. So participant 4 says, where do I find some ground in that shifting sense, and thinking I'm still made in the image of God? And another says, it's related to God's creations, how we are made interesting. I like that expression, because I think that it will lead people to think about where you come from and think about God's creation. Wesleyan theologian Keegan Osinski describes queer as something which resists a static, monadic model of the world and human life, and insists on a more nuanced, complex, ecstatic vision, full of possibility and without limitation. And there's a sense in which the shift into menopause is both an experience of the female body and also, in a sense, this sort of queer experience, challenging both a static sense of identity and notions of gender expectations and performance, as well as, of course, dealing with profound change. In thinking about an inclusive Methodist theology, then, it would be interesting to explore this vein further. Another really interesting thread that relates to Methodism is this metaphor of pioneering. So this participant said, knowledge-wise, you know this, but living with it is another thing. That's why I think, well, yes, we are learning the Bible for all our life. They were not a native speaker of language, this person. We are learning the Bible for all our life, and suddenly, well, you live with what you're learning. So there's this real sense of learning as you go. And in her 2022 article about fresh expressions and pioneering movements in the contemporary church, Jo Cox-Darling highlights the predominance of unpaid women facilitating this work. She describes unpaid, overworked lay women tirelessly setting out the chairs and putting on the kettle, who themselves are loved by the creator of the world. These women, as Sally Rush's ongoing research also suggests, are likely also to be going through perimenopause or have gone into menopause. They are thus also pioneers in their own lives, in their own bodies, navigating an unknown, emerging future, assessing what needs to be let go and what needs to be picked up. So it would be wonderful to see future research around this connection, exploration and care, which puts the perimenopausal body at the centre as the norm that it is in these pioneering contexts. So in thinking about care, there's a number of issues that came up. All the participants were struggling with issues around self-care and balancing it with service. And here's where perimenopause doesn't operate in a vacuum. You have parents, you have children, you have jobs, you have church, and so on. Flourishing, of course, the idea that we're moving towards flourishing is a strong Methodist value in the Methodist Church. And this came through strongly, alongside the idea of taking responsibility and agency for one's well-being. One participant did connect this explicitly with, they referred to their Arminian theology as serving this idea that I need to take agency for what's happening to me. I need to take responsibility for gaining knowledge and figuring out what I'm going to do about it. And also, they all gathered information from various sources. So this participant says, I believe in science. I think we need to use some scientific tools to use all these to explain our faith, because this is how God made the world. We can't just say, well, it is what it is. So she was very keen to integrate scientific advancement into her self-care and integrate it with her theology. And again, in terms of self-care, we had the participant too say, I've had women burst into tears on me, because again, it's this permission thing. And if they carry on feeling they need permission, it needs somebody to say, actually, you can put yourself first. Whether this be the kitchen ladies or the preachers in the pulpit. So another Methodist characteristic of this then, I think, is this idea of grassroots learning through community, gathering together and saying, well, what do you know? What do you know about it? I've learned this, medical professionals as well, and putting it all together. That seems to reflect a Methodist value of grassroots learning. We also see here the first issue, and this has come up before to do with stationing. If community and support with your peers is so important, this becomes a particular issue for ordained women who are being stationed and moved every few years. And it's a system that doesn't work well for such people. You have another quote there about taking care of yourself. It's very hard to do. This person is a minister. This final quote. How do you take care of yourself among the stresses of ministry? One thing that you might have noticed is that sometimes women become a little bit more vocal as they get older. And this emerged in the data as well. So participant 1 said, I can say what I like. And I asked, how does that feel? Feels quite good. Because in the past you think, wow, am I saying something that offends other people she kind of went like this. And then she said, but I think yes. After a certain age, you think, well, do I really care? So your mental and physical posture in the world changes. Another said, I don't feel broken, and in many ways I feel more confident than I have previously. I'm just becoming a more substantial woman. And we were playing on the physicality and that as a metaphor, both. I don't mind taking up a bit more space. She said, I'm more willing to begin to say when I think I've got some feedback. I have got things I can offer. So one might inquire if the church always welcomes such feedback, or women taking up this little bit more space. Returning again to Jo Cox-Darling, she argues that a spiritual, even mystic vision of church is threatening to the institutions and powers of today. She says it is wild and reckless and uncontainable and uncontrollable, and peaceful and reconciling and about justice and instinct. It's poetic and rhythmical and full of patterns and opportunity and relationality. There's a lot of words, I've got to remember them all. And relationality and seasonality and mindfulness. And it's indescribable, powerful, storied, visceral and tantalizing. That is the sort of missional spirit that is growing and prowling at the margins, and it's not as tame as our institutions would like to imagine. There is much resonance here with the dynamic, wild, perimenopausal experience, and perhaps then it's no surprise that women of this age are involved, and that in their liberated menopausal selves are more prepared to be uncontainable and uncontrollable, or exist in such contexts. Powerful, storied, and visceral. There's great room here to explore the pneumatology of perimenopause, another place for future interesting research. I want to have just a brief focus then, specifically on perimenopausal ministers. And this is the key quote here. Did you ever mention perimenopause when you were going through it? Immediately she said, oh gosh, no, I wouldn't have done. That's really interesting, isn't it? She was reflecting as she was answering. I wouldn't have done, I think, because I'm very much aware that I wouldn't have been willing to, no. Because in the church, as a woman, you've got to prove yourself. You've still got to prove that you can be as good as a bloke. I think you would be perceived, possibly perceived, and this could just be my thing, as less capable. So I said, this is very bad interviewing, very bad methodology, I couldn't help myself. I said, well, this is ironic, really, since you're going through all that and managing your job at the same time. And she said, well, precisely, absolutely. So there are practical difficulties to do with being a minister. I've mentioned stationing, this idea of are you showing weakness if you talk about needing accommodation for this natural transition in your life. A practical, theological, and crucially intersectional session on perimenopause and menopause should be a part of ministerial training for all ministers. Perhaps it is, I don't actually know. But if it isn't, it absolutely should be. Because this would mean to take seriously the embodied experience of women and others who menstruate and go through perimenopause. As Methodist theologian Jane Krask argues, the insistence on real possibilities of participation for all emerges from deep theological conviction. It is an essential component of a Wesleyan tradition that preaches grace for all. But as one participant said, that's really difficult if we never actually talk about it in the life of the church, and if we never in fact acknowledge it, even by having the correct bins for people to use. Finally, I want to suggest that the experience of menopause has something to offer all of us. It can serve not only, and I would say primarily, those in the pews and the pulpits who are going through perimenopause and into menopause, but it also has great and untapped usefulness as a metaphor. I believe it could richly serve institutions who are busy reworking and reshaping their perceived own change of narrative of change and decline, to do what Rebecca Chopp calls transforming the system with visions of new ways of being human. There is so much we can learn from the bloody difficult women, from the kitchen ladies, from the ones who, as one participant called, holding the church, these human beings at the centre of church life who are navigating this profound change. We are transfiguring our own narrative of decline on a daily basis, facing inevitable mortality, and reshaping nostalgia for youth and a glorious past into a freedom and a voice, a refined but purposeful justice-seeking role that, as one participant put it, makes our world a little lovelier. We can all be reminded that as one individual, whether a person or an institution, we have a lifespan. Decline and death are a part of our created individual life, but we are also and fundamentally part of an interconnected human and ecological system, local and global. And as Christians, as Methodists, we are an integral part of the mission of God that is bigger than us. So our energies and our bodies will nurture that system long after we are gone. The obligatory John Wesley quote, "You have no time to lose. See that you redeem every moment that remains." Thank you.